Hey guys, tonight we push open the creaky, swinging doors of a frontier saloon. Not to witness a gunfight or some wild Hollywood duel, but to listen closely for the quieter, stranger rhythm of its hidden rules. You've probably seen the movies: card tables glowing under lantern light, piano jangling, cowboys downing whiskey in dramatic gulps. But the real story? It wasn't so much about what you drank, as about how you drank it. The Old West Saloon had its own code, a set of unspoken rules that kept the whole dusty operation from collapsing into chaos. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. It always fascinates me to see people drifting to sleep across so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push the saloon doors open in your imagination, and the first thing that hits you isn't a hail of bullets or a dramatic shout, it's the smell. Tobacco smoke, sour beer, and sawdust scattered across the floor to soak up spills. A man snores in the corner, hat tilted over his face. The piano plinks a tune that sounds both cheerful and out of tune. This is the heart of the West, not duels, but drinks. Historians note that saloons served as community centers as much as bars. In towns with little else for social life, people came to drink, gamble, find entertainment, and sometimes sleep off a long cattle drive. They weren't just dens of sin, they were where men struck deals, hired ranch hands, and swapped news from afar. And yet, for all their rough charm, these saloons had rules. Not the kind nailed to walls, but the kind everyone just knew. They kept things running. Break one, and you risked more than embarrassment. You risked the wrath of the bartender, who often had more authority than the sheriff once you stepped inside. In some places, the first rule was about seating. Never sit at another man's poker table unless invited. That wasn't just a courtesy, it was survival. Card games were serious, and stealing a seat could trigger more than dirty looks. Joke 1. Imagine a sign above the table: reserved for men who yell loudly when they lose. Drinks themselves carried etiquette. Whiskey was often watered down, stretched by barkeepers who knew how to make a barrel last. Complaining too loudly about the taste was another unwritten offense. Everyone knew it was bad. Pointing it out just made you the enemy of the house. Historians still argue about how much control bartenders really had. Some describe them as peacekeepers, throwing out drunks before fights started. Others say they were opportunists, letting trouble brew if it meant more drinks sold. Either way, most accounts agree, the bartender was the referee of this dusty arena, and his judgment was final. Many saloons even had their own gambling rules. For example, debts had to be honored, even if you were drunk. Walk away from a poker loss without paying, and the whole room turned against you. A man's reputation in a saloon was currency. One bad move and you'd find yourself frozen out of the town's social life. Sometimes men marked their glasses with personal tokens, small wooden chips, cloth scraps, even tiny carvings, so no one else could claim their drink if they stepped away. Joke 2. The medieval version of this was probably monks writing their initials on the beer barrel. The frontier equivalent? A grubby handkerchief tied to a whiskey glass. Saloon etiquette extended beyond drinking, too. How you ordered mattered. A quiet nod or a tap on the counter showed respect. Shouting across the room marked you as a fool. Locals didn't need to holler. The bartender already knew their drink. Strangers who bellowed for service announced themselves as outsiders before they even took a sip. And perhaps most importantly, alcohol created obligations. If someone bought you a drink, you owed them one in return. It was an unwritten contract, and breaking it meant losing face. In a world where reputation meant everything, that was almost worse than losing at cards. Joke 3. Forget duels at dawn. The real fight starter was a man saying, "Thanks for the whiskey," and then never buying a round back. So as you sit quietly at a shadow table, scarf tucked close, you realize that the real saloon drama wasn't about bullets or brawls. It was about balance, respecting the little rules that let a noisy, smoky, unpredictable place keep from exploding. The code wasn't written on walls, but it was etched into every nod, every poured glass, every unspoken expectation. And tomorrow night, maybe we'll lean closer and listen to those rules unfold, one sip at a time. You shift on the creaky chair, letting the sawdust crunch under your boots, and start to notice how different this saloon feels from the glamorous ones on movie screens. In Hollywood, the bar gleams, the lamps glow warmly, and the floor looks almost polished. Here, in your mind's eye, the boards are warped, the lamps smoke, and the furniture looks like it survived one fight too many. And yet, this is where the unwritten rules of the West are strongest. Real saloons were often small, hastily built wooden structures. The early ones might just be a tent or shack with a plank counter. As towns grew, saloons expanded, but they were rarely elegant. They were dusty, noisy, and full of mismatched chairs and tables. Only in wealthier boomtowns did some begin to resemble the fancy establishments you see in films. And with this rough setting came a rough etiquette. Everyone knew that without some sort of code, chaos would win. After all, you've packed miners, cowhands, gamblers, and drifters into a smoky room with cheap liquor. There had to be boundaries. In some saloons, people used spittoons lined up along the walls, and there was an unspoken agreement not to spit anywhere else. Of course, that didn't always work, which explains why sawdust covered the floor, to soak up the misses. Joke 1. If you ever wanted proof that the West wasn't glamorous, just imagine the poor bartender sweeping up the days. Missed shots. And I don't mean bullets. Even in this chaos, seating mattered. There were rules about who could claim which corner. Local ranchers had their spots, gamblers claimed their poker tables, and drifters stayed to the edges unless invited closer. A stranger barging into the wrong space could cause more drama than a crooked card deal. Poker tables were sacred territory. Some saloons had house rules that regulars enforced. Newcomers were often tested, let in politely if they played fair, or frozen out if they got loud or dishonest. Historians still argue how much of this etiquette was spontaneous versus enforced by fear. Some see it as a natural community code, others as intimidation by the rougher regulars. Either way, stepping wrong could mean finding yourself face down in the street, without a bullet being fired. Many saloons also had standing zones near the bar, where newcomers were expected to linger until someone waved them into a circle. It was like the frontier version of standing awkwardly at a high school lunchroom, tray in hand, hoping someone says, "Hey, sit here." Joke 2. Imagine your toughest cowboy moment being ruined because no one invited you to the cool table. And of course, everyone knew the bartender was king. He wasn't glamorous, and usually not clean-shaven, but his nods and frowns dictated who got served and who got ignored. Sometimes a man would sit for half an hour without a drink because the bartender didn't trust him. That silence carried more weight than any drawn gun. Bartenders were considered peacekeepers in many towns. They carried clubs under the bar, not just to defend themselves, but to knock sense into drunk troublemakers. Many patrons respected them more than the sheriff. Joke 3. You could dodge the sheriff for days, but you couldn't dodge the bartender's glare. That was the real death sentence. So as you let the noise of the piano wash over you, scarf shifting on your neck, you see how this wasn't just a place for whiskey. It was a stage where unspoken rules held everyone in line. Break them, and you'd discover fast that the West's real duels weren't fought with guns. They were fought with silence, glares, and the bartender's final word. You lean your elbows on the sticky counter, the lantern smoke curling upward, and start noticing something subtle, the choreography of who gets served and when. No written list, no chalkboard menu, just a living rhythm that everyone in the saloon seemed to understand instinctively. Bartenders in frontier saloons often served regulars first, even if strangers waved coins in their hands. Loyalty mattered more than money. A man who had been drinking at the same bar for years earned the right to be poured before a newcomer, no matter how much gold dust jingled in his pouch. Sometimes regulars didn't even need to order. They just tapped the counter with a finger or tilted their glass, and the bartender refilled it without a word. Outsiders who tried the same trick were ignored, like toddlers demanding candy without saying, "Please." Joke 1. Imagine traveling days through desert and dust, finally making it to the bar, and the bartender says with his silence, "Not you, pal. He gets his watered-down whiskey first." This first come, first serve rule wasn't about who physically walked through the doors. It was about seniority. Strangers who got impatient sometimes shouted for service. That was a mistake. In many towns, raising your voice at the bartender was seen as the height of rudeness. Locals judged you instantly. At best, you'd be ignored. At worst, you'd be shoved out by the bouncer, or by the crowd itself. Historians still argue whether bartenders had that much power or whether the community around them enforced it. Some say the bartender was almost like a priest, keeper of rituals and rules. Others think it was just practical. In a crowded room, you don't want chaos at the counter. Some bartenders kept a literal, unwritten ledger in their heads, remembering who still owed for drinks weeks later. They'd serve you again, but only if you were trusted to settle up eventually. Joke 2. Imagine your credit score being judged not by a bank, but by whether you once stiffed a bartender for a nickel. The drinks themselves carried rules, too. Whiskey was the staple, cheap, rough, sometimes cut with turpentine or tobacco juice to stretch supplies. Beer, when available, was weak and often sour. Complaining about quality was pointless. The rule was, you drink it, or you don't. Make too much fuss, and you became the evening's entertainment as everyone laughed at the fussy Easterner. Frontier whiskey was sometimes called tarantula juice, or coffin varnish, because of how harsh it tasted. It wasn't about savoring flavors, it was about numbing the dust, fatigue, and loneliness of the trail. Joke 3. Imagine ordering a glass and realizing it tastes like varnish, then ordering a second one anyway, because, well, what else are you going to do in Dodge City at night? So you sip the imaginary drink in front of you, feeling the sawdusty air, and realize it wasn't the liquor that mattered most here. It was the ritual of getting it, knowing the rules, waiting your turn, showing respect to the bartender and to the rhythm of the place. The scarf at your neck feels warm against the din, and you start to see the truth. The Wild West Saloon was less a lawless den than a quiet court, where every nod and pour followed an invisible script. And if you didn't know the script, you didn't get a drink. You swirl the cloudy whiskey in your glass, and your nose twitches at the smell, half smoke, half something vaguely medicinal. This isn't the smooth amber liquid of modern bottles. This is frontier liquor, raw and unapologetic. And here's the strange truth. The drink itself was often terrible, but the etiquette around it mattered far more than the taste. Frontier whiskey was frequently diluted with water or stretched with ingredients that ranged from neutral to questionable: molasses, red pepper, or even kerosene. A glass might burn your throat more from additives than from alcohol. Locals didn't expect quality. They expected consistency. The bartender poured, you drank, you didn't complain. If a customer wrinkled his nose too obviously, it was considered rude. Everyone knew the whiskey was bad. Calling it out just broke the unspoken agreement. Some bartenders even had a phrase for complainers. "This ain't wine country." Imagine walking into a saloon, taking one sip, and saying, "Actually, I prefer something with oak notes and a vanilla finish." You'd be laughed all the way back to the train. The rule of silence about bad liquor kept the peace. After all, there wasn't much the bartender could do. Shipments came by rail or wagon, sometimes spoiled in the heat, sometimes cut along the way. Complaining was like scolding the sky for being too dusty. Better to drink, grimace quietly, and move on. Many saloons flavored their whiskey with burnt sugar or coffee grounds to mask the roughness. Beer was equally risky. It was usually shipped in barrels that went flat fast. Ice, when available, was a rare luxury hauled from distant mountains. Historians still argue whether this rough drinking culture toughened men or simply dulled their expectations. Some suggest the West's reputation for hard drinking cowboys came more from poor options than from heroic tolerance. Some saloons kept a single clean glass for special guests, like sheriffs or wealthy ranchers. Everyone else shared from cloudy mugs or metal cups, often rinsed only when the bartender remembered. So yes, you could die from a gunshot in the West, but more likely from whatever lived in the bottom of the communal whiskey glass. The unspoken rule was simple: don't insult the drink, and don't waste it. Pouring a half-full glass onto the floor was considered deeply disrespectful, both to the bartender and to the men who worked hard for their coin. Even spilling was frowned upon, though in fairness, most floors were already coated in a sticky mix of beer, tobacco juice, and mud. Sawdust was sprinkled across saloon floors not just for traction, but to soak up all the spit, beer, and blood that inevitably hit the ground. Think of it as the Old West version of a Swiffer mop, only far crunchier. So as you swallow the last of the harsh drink and set the cup down carefully, you've already followed one of the key saloon rules. Accept what's given, keep your comments to yourself, and let the ritual of drinking matter more than the liquid itself. The scarf at your neck feels a little warmer now, and you realize, in a land where whiskey could taste like turpentine, silence was golden. And in the silence, the saloon kept its strange, dusty harmony. You slide the empty glass across the counter, and the bartender nods, already wiping the rim with a rag that looks like it's seen more battles than most sheriffs. Just as you think you might be done for the night, the man beside you clinks a coin on the bar and says, "One more for my friend here." Suddenly, you've stepped into another unspoken law of the saloon, the reciprocal drink. In frontier culture, if someone bought you a drink, it wasn't just generosity. It was a binding social contract. At some point, tonight, tomorrow, or next week, you were expected to buy one back. To accept without returning the favor branded you as rude, unreliable, even dishonorable. There are accounts of men who failed to reciprocate becoming local jokes. Bartenders and regulars remembered them for years, muttering, "That fella never bought a round back." The insult wasn't small, it stuck like a burr in reputation. It's a little like a cowboy loyalty program: one whiskey in, one whiskey out, no points, no miles, just the threat of being laughed out of town. This ritual wasn't only about drinks, it was about trust. Sharing whiskey proved you were part of the group, someone who valued fairness. In lonely towns where strangers drifted in constantly, reciprocity built a fragile sense of belonging. The phrase, "my turn," became common shorthand in saloons. Failing to utter it after being treated was like slamming a door in someone's face. Historians still argue whether this ritual of rounds came from older European drinking customs, or if it grew uniquely on the American frontier. Either way, it gave a rhythm to nights that could otherwise spiral into chaos. Sometimes whole tables entered a spiral of rounds that lasted until dawn, each man insisting it was his turn, until wallets emptied and the bartender grew rich. Imagine trying to go home early, only for your buddy to shout, "Not so fast, it's my turn!" Congratulations, you're trapped until sunrise with a liver that hates you. The reciprocal drink wasn't just etiquette, it was also strategy. A man might buy you a glass to test your character. Would you return the favor? Would you show loyalty or stinginess? In a world where reputations decided jobs, poker partners, even protection, that one glass mattered. Cowboys on cattle drives often built bonds around shared whiskey. The one who never shared was soon distrusted with everything else, even the herd. Basically, if you couldn't be trusted with a shot of bad whiskey, no one was handing you 1,000-pound steer. So as you nod back to your newfound friend and gesture for another round, you're not just drinking, you're entering the strange, silent economy of saloon honor. Coins clink, glasses fill, and reputations are quietly forged with every pour. The scarf at your neck shifts as you tilt the glass again, and you realize, here, in this smoky room, generosity isn't optional. It's a law as firm as any written on paper. You don't notice it at first, because it's quieter than a piano chord or a chair breaking, but the ritual of drinking together has its own choreography. It starts with a nod, a coin, a pour, and then the most important part, what you do with your glass when the bartender sets it down. You lift, you wait, you glance at the others, and only when the little circle has formed, 2, 3, maybe 4 hands cradling cloudy liquor, do you drink. Not before. Not alone. The West can be lonely. The saloon answers by insisting you are not. In many American saloons, especially by the late 19th century, the custom of treating, buying around, and set-ups. A bottle on the table with glasses, sugar, water, maybe lemons if the place was fancy, made drinking a group act, not a solo performance. Travelers' accounts and city guides note that bartenders encouraged rounds because it kept everyone planted, sociable, and, let's be honest, spending. You learn fast that the glass has grammar. Setting it upright and close to the bar says, "I'm in for the next one." Tipping it on its side or pushing it back a hand's width says, "I'm bowing out," without insulting the man who paid. If you absolutely must refuse, you do it with a half smile and a soft line. "I'm standing guard over my saddle tonight," and you offer coffee or a sarsaparilla back as a peace gesture. That return offer matters. You're keeping the chain of goodwill unbroken even while you skip the whiskey. Some houses hung tin cups from little nails along the wall for common use, and a few kept a corkscrew on a chain bolted to the bar so no one could borrow it home. It wasn't hygienic by modern standards, but to the regulars it simply meant, this is a place where the bottle belongs to the table, not to the single hand. Somewhere out there is a forgotten cowboy saint of sanitation, quietly praying over that tin cup and losing the argument every single night. You watch how people time their sips. No one drains the glass ahead of the group. That's a sprint in a town that prefers shuffles. Men lift together, swallow together, and set down with a gentle tap, not a slam, because slamming says, "I'm chasing thunder," and tapping says, "I heard the weather too." If someone's new to the room and gulps, the seasoned hands offer a grin that's friendly and somehow corrective. The goal is harmony, not bravado. Sometimes the bottle lands on your table instead of another round from the bar. Now a different rule wakes up. The bottle travels clockwise. You don't hug it or measure generosity with an eyedropper. You pour steady, fair, and pass it on. Nothing will chill a table faster than the man who pours for himself with a generous hand and for the next fellow with a miserly one. The bartender might not see it, but the room does. Historians still argue whether clockwise passing and glass signals were widespread codes or localized house habits. Frontier etiquette wasn't uniform. A rule that felt sacred in Abilene might be unknown in Prescott. What is consistent in diaries and reminiscences is the expectation of reciprocity and pace. Drink with us, not at us. Answer a kindness with one of your own. Back near the piano, a ranch crew is toasting a finished drive. You hear the predictable toasts. To dry saddles and wet throats, to short fences and long pay. And then one weirdly specific. To the hind leg of a jackrabbit, may it outrun our debts. Every table has a private liturgy, half joke, half glue. You're invited to repeat it, because repetition is how a stranger becomes an echo, and an echo becomes a voice that belongs. Travelers in the 1880s noted that toasts were less florid than in eastern cities but more frequent. The West prized functional words and frequent rituals. You don't speechify, you acknowledge. The glass does most of the talking. If someone does speechify, it's usually because he's had just enough coffin varnish to believe he's running for mayor of the table. There's also a courtesy about turn order. If a man buys the first bottle, someone else claims the second before the first runs dry. If you wait until the last ounce to chirp, "My treat," the room reads it correctly. You're buying applause, not company. The clean play is to stand while the bottle still breathes and say, "Next one's mine." So the handoff is seamless. The barkeep appreciates it, the circle does too. Edge cases happen. What if a temperance-minded writer walks in? The room isn't automatically hostile. The polite compromise is, he keeps his glass upright with coffee, still lifts on the toasts, still taps. The ritual is bigger than the recipe. You can belong without the whiskey. You can't belong without the rhythm. A few bars kept a stone bottle, thick ceramic jug, behind the counter for water only, meant for the man who didn't drink but refused to break the pattern. He'd pour from the same shape as the whiskey and no one had to make a point of it. The West occasionally preferred kind fictions to awkward truths. Historians still argue whether refusing a drink outright was considered an insult or a respectable choice. The sources split by decade and region. Early boomtowns sound touchier. Later railroad towns, with more families and churches, sound more flexible. But across the map, the safest lane is always the same: decline softly, return a courtesy, keep the circle intact. A tricky moment arrives when someone at your elbow, maybe a gambler with nimble fingers, starts treating strategically. He buys you a pour before a card hand, hoping generosity will loosen your judgment. The better houses frown on it. The better players pretend not to notice and play tight anyway. You learn to say, obliged, and then prove obligation doesn't change your math. Free whiskey and good decisions have rarely been seen in the same room after midnight. Ask any undertaker or any piano. The night thickens, piano brighter, talk lower, and you can feel how the ritual has protected everyone from the worst versions of themselves. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but better than case. Guns stay holstered, chairs stay mostly upright, and the bartender's club stays where it belongs, under the counter, gathering dust. The bottle completes another loop, you match the pace, and the room hums like a contraption built out of nods and small mercies. And maybe that's the quiet genius of the saloon's unwritten rules. They turn a harsh drink into a gentle agreement, a rough room into a circle, and a long, lonely frontier into a place where, for a few minutes at a time, you lift and set down your glass together. The bottle has made its rounds, the piano clinks on in the corner, and now you notice another layer of etiquette at play, the marking of your glass. It looks silly at first, little scraps of cloth tied to handles, carved initials scratched in the side, even wooden chips resting on the rim. But here in the saloon, these are serious tokens. In many Western saloons, there weren't enough clean glasses to go around. Some patrons had to reuse the same cloudy mug all night. To avoid confusion, or theft, men marked their glasses with personal tokens, a coin, a pocket knife, or a bit of colored cloth. Bartenders respected these signals, knowing better than to hand the wrong glass to the wrong man. There are accounts of cowhands whittling tiny notches in the base of their glass, like branding cattle, so no one else would accidentally drink their whiskey. Others used their red kerchiefs, tying them around the handle like a flag of ownership. Imagine being tough enough to wrestle cattle all day, but still needing a bow tied around your cup so no one mistakes it for theirs. The ritual of marking went beyond hygiene. It was about identity. In a room where dozens of men looked similar, dusty hats, tired eyes, the glass became a stand-in for the man himself. Touching or moving someone's marked glass was almost the same as shoving him in the chest. Stealing or tampering with a man's drink was considered a serious insult. Court records from Dodge City even mention assaults that began because someone interfered with a fellow's liquor. Guns weren't drawn, but fists often were. Historians still argue how much this ritual was practical versus symbolic. Was it just about not losing track of your drink? Or was it a way of staking out a presence in the chaotic saloon, your one little island in a sea of noise? Either way, it worked. Bartenders sometimes encouraged marking glasses because it cut down on arguments. One even advertised that his saloon supplied string for the purpose, as if selling dignity by the yard. Complimentary string with every whiskey might be the least glamorous sales pitch in history. And beyond the glass, men sometimes marked their tables too. A gambler might scratch initials into the wood grain, or a ranch crew might leave a carved brand. These weren't vandalism so much as declarations. This is our circle. Outsiders respected, or at least recognized, the claim. The unspoken rule was simple. If you saw a marked glass, you didn't move it, spill it, or use it. Break that rule, and the saloon's fragile peace cracked fast. Some traveling guides for cowhands even warned about it. One booklet in the 1880s advised, "Respect the glass as you would the man. It is his seat and his word." So yes, the Old West did have its version of saving a chair with a jacket. Only the jacket was a sweaty scarf tied to a mug of bad whiskey. You sit back, scarf warm against your neck, and picture it clearly. The noisy saloon is less chaos than code. Every glass on the counter is a little flag, every token a promise that someone belongs here tonight. And if you learn to read those signals, you survive the evening without a fight. Because in this dusty room, the mark on your cup isn't just decoration, it's your passport to belonging. The piano plays a wobbling tune, and through the haze of smoke and chatter you notice something else. Not every face in the saloon belongs to a dusty cowba. Some of the most important figures in the room are women, though not the fainting Hollywood heroines. Here, their presence shapes the rules as much as the bartender's glare. In many frontier towns, women were rare, but when present in saloons they often had specific roles, performers, waitresses, sometimes even owners. A few saloons were outright run by formidable women who knew how to keep peace better than most sheriffs. Their authority wasn't written in law, but everyone in the room respected it. You see a woman with a scarlet shawl glide past the tables, collecting empty mugs, giving a sharp look to a drunk on the verge of trouble. He lowers his voice instantly. She doesn't need a weapon. Her disapproval carries more weight than any revolver. Some accounts describe women who could ban troublesome patrons. One owner in Deadwood was famous for snapping her fingers at rowdy men. 2 hulking employees would then escort the offender outside, no questions asked. Locals whispered she had more power than the marshal. Imagine being a gunslinger with a reputation, only to be defeated by a 5-foot-tall saloon keeper saying, "Not in my house, sweetheart." Women also set certain drinking boundaries. A man who shouted obscenities in their presence risked being mocked by the entire room. If a performer was singing, it was rude to interrupt her with loud boasting. A strange kind of politeness grew up around the stage. Even rowdy cowhands hushed long enough for a song. Saloon singers and dance hall girls were central to the atmosphere. They drew crowds, kept men buying drinks, and sometimes helped the bartender spot cheats or troublemakers. Their social leverage was enormous, even if history often paints them as background characters. Historians still argue whether women in saloons were more exploited or empowered. Some sources emphasize their vulnerability. Others highlight the real authority they wielded in spaces where men were expected to follow their lead. The truth is tangled somewhere between. One diary recalls a woman breaking up a fight by whacking both men with a rolled-up songbook. Neither dared retaliate. They just slunk away while the piano kept playing. So yes, sometimes the deadliest weapon in a saloon wasn't a Colt revolver, but a soprano with good aim. For women owners especially, keeping order was business. Drunks who wrecked furniture cut into profits, so they enforced a brand of discipline sharper than any sheriff. Regulars who respected the rules found themselves in good standing. Outsiders who didn't were shown the door. In mining camps, hurdy-gurdy houses, dance saloons with women performers operated under strict codes. Patrons who harassed dancers too roughly could be barred permanently. In other words, the West had bouncers long before neon signs said, "No shirt, no shoes, no service." So as you sit with your glass marked by a ragged scarf around your own neck tugged loose, you realize the unwritten rules weren't only enforced by men. Women, whether singing, pouring, or managing, were the hidden law of the saloon, quietly keeping the chaos just balanced enough so the night could go on. The night stretches on, and the saloon grows hazier with smoke and laughter. Somewhere between the poker tables and the bar you begin to notice another set of invisible rules: how loud, or how quiet, you were allowed to be. Frontier saloons were rowdy, but there was an art to that rowdiness. A man who drank too loudly, shouting every sentence, risked becoming the evening's nuisance. On the flip side, a man who sat in stony silence, glaring into his whiskey, was seen as suspicious. In a world where strangers were common, being too quiet could make others wonder if you were hiding something, or waiting for trouble. The balance was delicate. Laugh, but not obnoxiously. Sing with the piano, but not over it. Tell a story, but don't hog the air. The saloon was a noisy place, but it was a measured noise, and everyone seemed to sense where the line was. Some travelers' diaries described cowboys who got so drunk they began reciting Bible verses at full volume, an act that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. Too much piety in a saloon was just as disruptive as too much profanity. Imagine a crowd of half-drunk miners groaning, "Not another sermon, Bill, just pass the bottle." The same went for silence. Men who lurked without joining conversation, or who refused to toast when glasses were raised, made others nervous. Sometimes silence was taken as an insult, as if you thought yourself above the company. Other times it marked you as dangerous. After all, the quiet ones were said to be the ones you had to watch. Many saloons actually encouraged sing-alongs to avoid awkward silences. A piano or fiddle kept conversations flowing, making it harder for tension to fester. Music, in this sense, was as much crowd control as entertainment. Historians still argue how universal this etiquette was. Some claim it grew naturally. Everyone wanted the saloon to feel safe enough to drink in. Others suggest bartenders enforced it with subtle signals, pouring quicker for the cheerful, slower for the sullen. One bartender in Abilene supposedly had a habit of whistling whenever the room felt too quiet, as if to remind everyone, "Keep it light, boys, or get out." Imagine your entire reputation depending on whether you could sing in tune with a piano that hadn't been tuned in 10 years. Even humor had boundaries. Teasing was fine. Mocking too harshly wasn't. A stranger who misread the tone could turn a cheerful night sour. In a world of constant drifting, men learned to read the room fast. Frontier etiquette. Manuals written later in the 19th century even warned newcomers not to brag too loudly or sulk too much in saloons. Moderation, ironically, was the key to surviving heavy drinking culture. Which makes you wonder, if moderation was the key, why was the whiskey nicknamed coffin varnish? So as you sip your harsh drink, scarf warm at your neck, you begin to see the saloon less as a chaotic brawl and more as a fragile orchestra. Everyone had a part to play, voices rising and falling, laughter punctuating the piano, silence kept in its proper corners. The rules of noise were never posted, but everyone felt them. Break them, and suddenly the music of the night turns sour. You shift in your chair as the poker table near the back grows louder, the clink of chips echoing under the smoky lamplight. Cards flick through the air, faces harden, and you realize that if there was anywhere the unwritten saloon code became sacred, it was at those green felt tables. Poker was the lifeblood of many saloons. The house earned a percentage of each pot, or charged players by the hour for their seat. Games could last all night, sometimes days, and fortunes of cowhands, miners, and gamblers changed with every hand, and yet money wasn't the only thing at stake. There were rules, unspoken but ironclad, about how you behaved when whiskey and cards mixed. First rule, losers take it quietly. Grumbling was allowed, flipping the table wasn't. Everyone understood bad luck, but no one tolerated tantrums. Break that rule, and you'd find the whole room against you faster than a bullet could fly. Some towns even had a phrase for it. Saloon justice. A man who threw cards or overturned a table could expect to be carried out, sober or not, by the other players themselves. Imagine losing a hand, kicking over the table in fury, and being punished not by the sheriff but by 6 irritated men in suspenders who just wanted their game back. Second rule, don't touch another man's cards or chips. To even lean across the table was a violation. Touching someone else's hand wasn't just cheating, it was an insult, like accusing them of dishonesty. Accusations of cheating did happen, and they were some of the few sparks that led to violence in saloons. But often, it wasn't the cheating itself that caused fights. It was the violation of the ritual, the breaking of the invisible trust at the table. Historians still argue whether poker tables were actually more dangerous than bar counters. Some say yes, because money inflamed tempers. Others point out that poker had such rigid etiquette that it often kept things calmer than drunken shouting at the bar. To make cheating harder, some houses required players to keep both hands visible on the table. A cowboy resting his hand under the table might get accused of hiding cards. Or worse. Picture a grown man forced to sit like a schoolboy, hands up where everyone can see them, while pretending he's a hardened outlaw. Third rule, the dealer is king. Whether chosen by the table or appointed by the house, the dealer's authority was absolute. Arguing with him risked being barred from play. Many dealers carried a small derringer or knife, not to use, but to remind players who was in charge. In some boomtowns, dealers were professionals hired by saloons specifically to keep order at tables. Their word was law. If they said a hand stood, it stood. Which makes you think, maybe the real sheriff of the West wasn't wearing a star. Maybe he was just a guy in a vest holding a deck of cards. So, as you watch the chips stack and the cards shuffle, scarf snug against the lamplight glow, you realize that poker wasn't about fortune alone. It was about ritual, trust, and honor, the fragile threads that kept the whole room from unraveling. In a place where whiskey blurred judgment, the rules of the table kept the peace. And breaking them was one of the surest ways to find yourself outside, in the mud, reputation in ruins. The piano stumbles into another tune, cards slap at the tables, and you watch as a ranch hand across the room tips his hat and says, "Your glass is empty, friend. Let me get you one." A kind offer, sure, but in this dusty room nothing is ever that simple. You've just witnessed another of the saloon's subtle tests, the use of whiskey as a way to measure trust. In the West, buying a man a drink could be pure generosity, or a test of loyalty. Accepting meant you owed him, not just another glass, but maybe even a bit of camaraderie later on. Declining too brusquely could be taken as an insult. Men often said "much obliged," whether or not they wanted the liquor, because refusing wasn't just about taste, it was about relationships. The ritual went deeper. Sometimes gamblers bought drinks for new players at the table, hoping loosened judgment would tilt the odds. Other times, employers treated workers after a cattle drive to reinforce bonds. A whiskey was more than whiskey. It was a handshake poured in liquid form. Some drifters were known to drink and dash. The code, not by skipping the bill, but by accepting free drinks and then leaving town before ever returning the favor. These men quickly earned reputations that followed them, the frontier's version of a bad Yelp review. Imagine your entire identity summed up by the phrase, "Oh, him? Never bought a round back." That's frontier social death. There were other dangers, too. A hostile man might buy you a drink just to test your reaction. Accepting with suspicion could spark tension. Refusing without tact could spark worse. The right answer was usually some version of politeness. Lift the glass, toast, sip, and then carefully watch your back. Accounts from cattle towns mention men turning a free drink into a way to size up strangers. "See how he drinks," one rancher supposedly said. "You can tell if he's a cheat by the way he holds his glass." Historians still argue how much meaning people actually read into such gestures versus how much later storytellers exaggerated. Some scholars think frontier folk were simply cautious. Others suggest that the saloon's rituals were a kind of theater, where men pretended everything carried deeper meaning. One diary records a saloon visitor who refused a drink by saying, "My horse has the fever. I must ride sober." It became a running joke for weeks, repeated every time anyone turned down a glass. Poor man probably became known forever as Horse Fever Joe, whether he liked it or not. These exchanges weren't only about the liquor, they were about marking who was inside the circle and who remained outside. Accept a drink, you were in. Decline clumsily, you were out. In some towns, it was expected that travelers stood around on their first night as a gesture of goodwill to locals. Failure to do so made you look standoffish or cheap. In other words, the price of admission wasn't on the sign outside, it was in the bottle inside. So as you watch the man tip his hat and sip his whiskey, scarf loose at your throat, you see the rule at work. Whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a subtle tool for testing, binding, and sorting. And if you wanted to last in this room, you had to read the hidden meaning in every raised glass. The piano clangs louder, chairs scrape against the sawdust-covered floor, and a new sound cuts through, the sharp voice of a ranch hand yelling, "Hey, that's my bottle!" Suddenly the room stills, because everyone knows he's not just making noise, he's calling out a violation of one of the strictest unspoken laws of the saloon: never touch another man's liquor. In frontier etiquette, a bottle on the table or a glass marked with a token was considered personal property, even if technically bought from the bar. To lay a hand on it without invitation was as disrespectful as taking a man's saddle horse without asking. Saloons were communal in spirit, but ownership was fiercely respected. One miner in Virginia City reportedly carried his whiskey bottle around the room with him like a baby, tucking it under his arm whenever he left the table to make sure no one dared sample it. You may not know love until you've seen a man cradle a bottle of vodka like it's his firstborn child. This taboo made sense in a world where whiskey wasn't just drink, but wages. A bottle could represent a week's worth of hard labor. To drink from another man's supply was practically theft, and theft of dignity at that. Court dockets from Kansas and Colorado show multiple cases labeled affray or disturbance that began with someone interfering with another's drink. Guns weren't drawn every time, but fists usually were. Historians still argue whether these rules grew out of scarcity. Liquor was expensive and hard to haul, or whether it was about honor in a culture obsessed with personal respect. Likely it was both. Some saloons enforced this code by keeping bottles behind the bar and pouring only glasses, precisely so no man could accuse another of bottle stealing. Of course, this meant the bartender guarded the whiskey like a dragon on a pile of gold. But when bottles were on tables, etiquette was strict. Pour for yourself, pass promptly, never hog the cork, and above all, don't sneak a sip from someone else's share. It wasn't about generosity, it was about order. One popular 1870s guide to frontier behavior warned newcomers that no greater insult can be offered than to lay hand upon another's glass unbidden. That's how widely understood the rule was, and if someone did break it, the bartender, again, played judge. If he thought it was an honest mistake, he might smooth things over with another pour. But if it looked deliberate, he might side with the aggrieved, toss out the offender, and let the man's reputation rot. Better to be thrown into the horse trough outside than live forever as the fellow who swiped old Tom's whiskey. So as you sit with your own glass, scarf brushing your collar, you understand why the whole room quieted at that ranch hand's shout. In a land where law came second to honor, the bottle was more than booze. It was boundary, symbol, and fragile peacekeeper. Cross it, and the room turned against you faster than the whiskey could burn down your throat. The room relaxes again after the bottle incident, and you notice how the bartender, calm as a preacher, polishes another cloudy glass. It's subtle, but everyone in the room knows. The bartender is the referee, the judge, and sometimes the executioner of the saloon's rules. In many frontier towns, bartenders were more respected than sheriffs inside their establishments. They controlled the flow of liquor, enforced house etiquette, and often kept a heavy club or a sawed-off shotgun behind the counter, not for drama, but for keeping peace. Their nods, glares, and silences decided who stayed and who left. You watch as a drunk stumbles at the bar, slamming his fist for another drink. The bartender doesn't pour. Instead, he folds his arms and waits. The whole room sees it, the unspoken message that this man's cut off. The drunk protests, but no one supports him. The bartender's word is law. Some bartenders were famous for their methods. One in Dodge City was said to keep a weighted club under the counter, nicknamed the Persuader. Another swore by tossing drunks directly into the horse trough outside, claiming cold water sobered them faster than jail. Imagine Yelp reviews of the 1870s. Great whiskey, decent piano, bartender threw me in a trough, 2 stars. Bartenders also mediated disputes before they escalated. If 2 men raised their voices, the barkeep would lean in and remind them to take it outside. If they didn't, he might quietly wave to a couple of loyal regulars to escort them out. Violence wasn't good for business. Broken furniture and spooked customers cost money. Some bartenders kept detailed tabs on customers' debts, not just for money, but for behavior. A man who started fights too often might find himself unwelcome, no matter how much gold he had. Historians still argue whether bartenders acted primarily out of self-interest or genuine community care. Some describe them as shrewd businessmen. Others paint them as surrogate mayors of the saloon, keeping fragile order in a lawless town. One barkeep in Colorado even posted a hand-painted sign reading, "Don't shoot the piano player, he's doing his best." It became an unspoken house rule. Though realistically, the piano player probably wished there was also a sign saying, "Don't shoot the bartender either." The bartender also controlled when the night ended. He decided when to blow out lamps, when to serve the last pour, and when to nudge the stragglers out into the street. Unlike Hollywood, saloons didn't run forever into dawn. Someone had to lock up, sweep sawdust, and set chairs back upright. In boomtowns, some saloons stayed open 24 hours, but even then bartenders rotated in shifts, each inheriting responsibility for keeping peace. The most heroic act wasn't a high noon duel. It was a man working back-to-back shifts pouring watered whiskey without collapsing. So as you glance at the man behind the bar, his rag moving in steady circles, scarf soft against your throat, you see the truth. The sheriff wore the badge, but in this smoky room, the bartender carried the real power. His quiet authority, his quick hand under the counter, his judgment of fairness. These were the laws that mattered most. The crowd settles into a steady hum again, and you notice something curious. A couple of cowhands step up to the bar, and before ordering, they each unbuckle their gun belts and lay them gently on the counter. The bartender nods. The rest of the room doesn't flinch. You've just witnessed another strange bit of etiquette, placing your weapon on the bar. In some saloons, it was common practice for men to set down their pistols or knives when drinking. This wasn't surrender, it was a truce. By showing the weapon openly, you sent the signal. I'm not here to start trouble, I'm here to drink. It was a ritual of uneasy trust in a world where tempers could flare fast. Of course, this didn't mean the weapon was far away. A revolver on the bar was still close enough to grab in a heartbeat. But the gesture mattered. It was a way of telling the room that, at least for the moment, the whiskey mattered more than a fight. In some mining towns, men went further, checking their guns at the door with a hired guard, or tying them with leather straps to make drawing slower. Others mocked this as cowardice, but it kept the peace. You can picture the bartender sighing with relief, thinking, "At least if you shoot, you'll ruin my counter instead of my mirror." Weapons on the bar also sent a message of equality. By laying down steel, men placed themselves in the same vulnerable state as everyone else. It was a quiet contract. No one would use the moment to strike, because then the fragile code broke for everyone. Historians note that weapons etiquette varied by town. Some strictly banned firearms inside saloons, others tolerated them so long as they were visible and idle. In both cases, the idea was the same: to avoid hidden treachery. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or rare. Some diaries mention it often, others never. It may have depended on the local sheriff, the mood of the town, or even the temperament of the bartender. One famous saloon in Montana kept a wooden rack behind the bar specifically for knives and pistols, like a coat check. The sign above it read, "Leave steel, keep peace," which sounds noble, until you realize someone had to guard a wall of drunken men's weapons all night. Talk about job hazards. Even when guns weren't on the bar, the rule was the same: violence paused while glasses clinked. A duel might be brewing outside, but in a saloon, etiquette demanded a kind of temporary truce. The whiskey bottle, in its way, was more powerful than the six-shooter. In court testimony from the 1880s, several men recalled that disputes delayed by taking a drink often fizzled out entirely. The act of sharing liquor cooled tempers more effectively than threats ever did. Maybe bartenders should have charged double for truce whiskey. So as you sit there with your scarf warm at your neck, listening to the muffled thud of pistols being set aside, you realize that the saloon wasn't just a place of chaos. It was a space where even guns obeyed the unspoken rules, where for an hour, at least, the laws of whiskey outweighed the laws of the Wild West. The saloon air grows thicker as the lamps sputter, and you begin to notice the little signals that don't involve drinks or guns at all, just clothing. A tilt of a hat, the hang of a coat, the angle of a scarf. These were part of the silent language of the saloon. In many towns, a man's hat and scarf were as much a social marker as his wallet. Keeping a hat on inside wasn't disrespectful the way it is now, it was expected. But how you placed it mattered. Hat left on the head meant you were still in the game, still watching. Hat set on the bar might say you were winding down. Hat on a chair? A claim, "This is my seat, don't touch it." The scarf, bright kerchiefs that cowboys wore around their necks, carried meaning too. A scarf tied loose over the shoulder often signaled relaxation. "I'm off duty tonight." A scarf pulled high over the mouth could mean dust from the trail, or mistrust in the room. Some crews developed their own scarf codes. Ranch hands from one outfit wore red, another blue, so they could find each other quickly in a crowded saloon. Outsiders learned to tread carefully. Taking a wrong seat among a crew was like barging into a family dinner uninvited. Imagine showing up with the wrong color scarf, only to be told you'd better start drinking twice as fast to make up for it. There was also a ritual around leaving. A man ready to call it a night often placed his hat by the door before settling his tab. It was a signal to the bartender and his friends that he was done, without having to shout over the piano. Forget to leave this clue, and someone might buy you another round you weren't ready for. Diaries mention that in busy saloons, clothing gestures helped bartenders keep order. With dozens of patrons coming and going, small cues like a hat on a hook or scarf on a chair marked who was still paying and who was heading out. Historians still argue whether these signals were truly standardized or just improvised. Some insist there were widely recognized habits across the frontier. Others believe each town had its own quirks. But whatever the case, the symbolism mattered. Everyone was looking for ways to make sense of crowded, chaotic nights. One story tells of a cowboy in Kansas who accidentally sat on another man's hat. The owner didn't fight him. He simply demanded the offender buy a round for the whole table. That hat ended up being the most expensive piece of clothing in town that night. So yes, in the West, hats didn't just cover heads, they emptied wallets too. And women noticed these codes as well. Performers could spot who was courting attention by the way a scarf was knotted, or who had money by the shine on their boots. A lot could be read in an outfit, and everyone knew it. Gamblers especially cultivated dress signals, clean linen shirts, silk scarves, polished boots, to project confidence and intimidate rivals. In contrast, trail-weary cowhands sometimes deliberately kept their clothes dusty, a badge of authenticity. Which meant half the room looked like it was auditioning for a fashion show, and the other half looked like it had just lost a fight with a laundry tub.so. As you finger your own scarf, soft against your throat, you realize, in the saloon, clothes spoke. Hats, scarves, coats, these weren't just fabric, but words in a silent codebook. And if you misread them, the night could end awkwardly, or expensively, before the last note of the piano faded. The night wears on, and the saloon grows thick with the smell of spilled beer, lamp oil, and pipe smoke. You glance toward the back corner where a cowboy slumps against the wall, chin on chest, his glass still half full. His friends laugh and steady him, sliding coins across the counter to settle his bill. Here's another unwritten law of the saloon: you never leave your drunk behind. In many frontier towns, saloon culture demanded that companions looked after each other when someone overindulged. If a man passed out, his crew was expected to haul him home, or at least to a bunkhouse. To leave him sprawled on the floor was considered disgraceful, not just for him, but for the friends who abandoned him. Some accounts describe bartenders pouring buckets of cold water over unconscious patrons to rouse them, then handing them over to friends like a parcel marked fragile. One even kept a cot in the back labeled the drunkard's bed. Imagine paying your tab and getting a receipt that says, includes one free bucket of water over the head. It wasn't just about kindness, it was about reputation. A man who drank too much was often forgiven. After all, frontier life was hard. But friends who failed to cover his bill or help him stagger home earned lasting scorn. Loyalty was tested in whiskey as much as on the trail. In cattle towns, cowhands were often paid in bulk after a long drive. Whole crews would storm saloons together, spending weeks of wages in a night. When one man collapsed, the others pooled coins to pay for him without question. Historians still argue whether this practice was altruism or simply necessity. Some suggest it was about honor among men. Others think it was practical. If you abandoned a drunk tonight, you couldn't count on anyone helping you when it was your turn to tip face first into the sawdust. Occasionally, local pranksters took advantage of this loyalty by faking a stupor. Friends would pay their tab, only to find out later the man had been perfectly awake, enjoying a free night. The frontier version of ghosting was apparently just pretending to snore until someone else covered your drinks. And when drunks couldn't be carried home, they sometimes ended up propped against the hitching post outside, left to sleep in the cool air. Locals walked past without mocking too loudly, because everyone knew it could just as easily be them next week. Some sheriffs even issued informal rules. As long as he's not blocking the door, let him sleep it off. Arresting every drunk would have filled jails by sundown. In other words, the horse trough was the West's unofficial detox center.so. As you watched the cowboy's friends hoist him up by the arms, scarf slipping sideways around his neck, you see the truth of this rule. Drinking wasn't solitary here. It was a group activity, and loyalty mattered more than sobriety. The saloon was rough, yes, but it expected a certain care among its patrons. Leave no man behind, that was the real code in the bottom of the glass. The piano plays softer now, almost swallowed by the hum of voices, and your eyes drift toward the small stage near the center of the saloon. A fiddle joins in, clumsy but cheerful, and suddenly you realize something. Music isn't just entertainment here, it's crowd control. Saloons often hired piano players, fiddlers, or small bands not just to liven the mood but to keep the energy flowing smoothly. Music filled awkward silences, drowned out insults, and gave drunks something to sing with instead of something to fight over. In that way, the piano player was as important to keeping order as the bartender's club, and there was etiquette around the music, too. You didn't shout over a singer, at least not without consequences. You didn't heckle the piano player, unless you wanted a roomful of dirty looks. And if a man requested a song, he was expected to tip. That wasn't written on the walls, but everyone knew it. One saloon in Montana actually painted a sign that read, "Please don't shoot the piano player. He's doing his best." The line became famous and spread to other towns. Somewhere, a poor piano player probably thought, "That's the lowest bar of praise I've ever gotten." Sometimes the music set the rhythm for drinking. A lively jig meant faster rounds. A slow ballad encouraged quieter sipping. Patrons learned to pace themselves by the tune, like dancers who needed the beat to know when to step. Many piano players doubled as lookouts for the bartender. With their perch facing the room, they could signal trouble with a change in tempo or a sudden loud chord. A shift in the music was the bartender's early warning system. Historians still argue how much respect musicians really had. Some accounts suggest they were beloved, treated like minor celebrities. Others paint them as near the bottom of the saloon hierarchy, poorly paid and constantly harassed. Perhaps both were true, depending on the night. Fiddlers were sometimes paid in drinks instead of money. One journal mentions a fiddler who refused to stop playing even after he collapsed from too much whiskey. He simply played lying on the floor. You know you're dedicated when your encore is horizontal. The rules around music extended to dancing as well. In hurdy-gurdy saloons, women danced with paying partners, and etiquette demanded men treat them with respect. Rough handling earned swift ejection. Even in rowdy towns, the dance floor had its own boundaries. Dance hall girls often earned their pay by keeping men entertained without letting things spiral. A smile, a step, a laugh. Those were part of the saloon's machinery of order, no less than whiskey or cards. If you thought piano players had it tough, imagine dancing politely with someone who smelled like trail dust and regret.so as you listened to the plunk of keys and scrape of bow, scarf loose against your collar. You realize how music stitched the room together. It wasn't about art, it was about rhythm, a steady current that turned a powder keg of whiskey and tempers into something that, somehow, still held. The saloon's unwritten law wasn't just in glasses or cards. It was in the melody too, quiet rules hummed into being by men with callous fingers and a piano that never quite stayed in tune. The lamps sputter lower, shadows creeping across the sawdust floor, and the saloon begins to shift into that odd space between noisy life and drowsy closure. At the bar, a newcomer leans in, waving coins, shouting for service. Nobody moves. The bartender ignores him, and you notice the sidelong glances from regulars. You've just seen another of the saloon's hidden codes. The way you order matters. In frontier saloons, shouting for service marked you instantly as an outsider. Regulars knew that a nod, a tap on the bar, or quiet eye contact was the proper signal. Loud demands disrupted the rhythm and were seen as disrespectful, especially to the bartender. The newcomer doesn't realize it. He bangs the counter again, coins clattering, and still nothing. Someone chuckles, someone else mutters, "Greenhorn." Eventually the bartender pours him a drink, but not quickly, and everyone sees that delay as deliberate punishment. Some bartenders made a game of this. They'd serve locals lightning fast while leaving strangers waiting painfully long, just to test their patience. Only after a man proved himself with good manners, or with a round for the room, would service become smooth. Frontier bartenders were basically running the 19th century version of a VIP lounge, except the velvet rope was a raised eyebrow, Etiquette also applied to what you ordered. Whiskey was standard. Beer, if available, was acceptable. But asking for fancy mixed drinks, gin fizz, champagne cocktail, invited ridicule. The frontier palate wasn't subtle. The rule was, drink what everyone else is drinking, and don't get clever. Cocktail culture was booming in eastern cities by the mid-1800s, but frontier saloons rarely had the ingredients or patience. Ordering one out west was like asking a chuck wagon cook for creme brulee. Historians still argue whether bartenders truly disdained complicated orders or whether they simply lacked supplies. Either way, most evidence suggests locals mocked anyone who tried to bring city habits into dusty cattle towns. One diary tells of a traveling salesman in Abilene who ordered wine. The bartender poured him something vaguely red and sour. The salesman drank politely, then spent 2 days sick in bed. Lesson learned: never trust a wine list that doubles as shoe polish. There were even rules about paying. Coins on the bar were acceptable. Slamming them down hard, however, was rude, as if you were accusing the barkeep of dishonesty. The polite way was to place the money gently or let the bartender keep a small tab running. Some saloons preferred cash on the nail, payment at the moment of service, to prevent debts from piling up. Others allowed trusted regulars to run tabs. Reputation determined which system you got, and so the saloon became a quiet classroom. Strangers arrived, thinking their money alone would earn them respect. Instead, they learned the hard way. It was manners, patience, and conformity to the unwritten code that secured a place at the bar. In other words, your coins bought the whiskey, but your behavior bought the glass it came in. So as you sipped slowly, scarf soft at your throat, you realized that in this smoky room, etiquette was more valuable than gold dust. You didn't just drink, you performed a ritual of respect. And only those who learned the language of nods and taps truly belong. The night deepens, and you can feel the shift in mood, newcomers thinning out, regulars leaning heavier into their chairs, the room breathing in a slower rhythm. In this atmosphere, another saloon truth becomes clear: locals and strangers lived by different sets of rules. Saloons were gathering points for long-timers and drifters alike. But while the doors swung open to anyone with coin, how you were treated inside depended on whether you were known. Locals could break a rule and be forgiven. A stranger who slipped once might never be welcome again. You notice it at the poker table. A cowboy from out of town slams his cards after losing, and the dealer frowns. If a local had done it, laughter might have smoothed it over. But with this outsider, the silence grows heavy. Trust is earned slowly here, and lost quickly. Some towns had a custom of making newcomers buy a round for the room on their first night. It wasn't extortion, it was initiation. Those who complied were accepted. Those who refused were labeled tight-fisted, a word as damning as cheater. Imagine walking in for one quiet drink and walking out broke, all because welcome to town meant buying whiskey for 20 men. The divide wasn't only in money, it was in how you carried yourself. Locals had history, friends, a rhythm to their drinking. Strangers were watched carefully. Did they drink too fast? Did they talk too big? Did they dodge a return round? Every movement was judged. Cattle towns especially had transient populations. Cowboys rode in after long drives, flush with pay, then disappeared. Their reputation often ended the moment they left town. Locals, by contrast, had to maintain theirs week after week, which made them more cautious. Historians still argue whether this tension kept saloons safer or more dangerous. Some think outsiders were treated harshly to maintain order. Others argue the suspicion itself bred fights, since newcomers felt cornered. In Dodge City, saloons were known to give locals cheaper whiskey than travelers, same bottle, different price. Outsiders paid the stranger's tax. The frontier really invented surge pricing. Uber just added cars. There was also the matter of silence. Locals could sip quietly without suspicion, because everyone already knew them. A stranger who sat too quiet might be mistaken for a cheat, a spy, or a man about to draw. Reputation softened stillness into harmlessness. Without it, silence was threatening. Some travelers noted that strangers often had to spend several nights before being fully accepted. Buying rounds, joining songs, or telling stories were ways to bridge the gap. So yes, the fastest way to make friends wasn't your charm. It was your willingness to fund a sing-along with whiskey.so as you sit with your scarf loose and your glass marked. You can feel the saloon's eyes weighing you, deciding whether you're in or out. In this smoky theater, belonging wasn't about who you were outside. It was about how you played the part inside. And by now, maybe you've learned the lines well enough to pass. The lamps are burning low now, throwing long shadows across the warped floorboards. One by one, chairs scrape back, coins are counted, hats lifted from hooks. The final unwritten law of the saloon begins to show itself. Know when the night is over. Saloons didn't usually stay open all night. Even in boomtowns, bartenders set hours, and regulars respected closing time. The signal was clear, lamps turned down, piano stilled, and the bartender's rag moving in slower, final circles. To linger too long after that was to break one of the most sacred rules, forcing a tired barkeep to shove you into the street. The etiquette was quiet. Men settled their tabs without argument. Hats went on, scarves tightened, and boots shuffled toward the swinging doors. For all the rowdiness of earlier hours, the ending had a ritual calm to it. In some towns, closing time meant the barkeep blew out every lamp but one, leaving patrons to finish their last drink in near darkness. When that lamp went out, so did the night. Imagine your final sip of coffin varnish illuminated only by the faint glow of last call. Romantic in its own way, if you don't think too hard about the taste. The etiquette extended outside. A man stumbling too loud in the street could disgrace himself and his crew. Friends were expected to guide him home quietly, avoiding attention from the sheriff. In a place where reputations were currency, even the way you left a saloon mattered. In some cattle towns, ordinances required saloons to close at midnight. Sheriffs rarely enforced it strictly, but bartenders did, since they were the ones cleaning up. Historians still argue whether the quiet endings were respect or just exhaustion. Some suggest men valued the bartender too much to push him. Others think whiskey simply dulled them into submission. Either way, most nights ended not with drama but with slow, weary exits. A few saloons had an unofficial tradition, bartenders pouring a nightcap on the house for their best regulars. Not generosity, exactly, but a way to send the loyal home happy. Imagine being too drunk to notice you've been honored with the free, last terrible whiskey of the night. The room empties. Chairs rest upside down on tables. Sawdust crunches underfoot as the barkeep sweeps. Outside, the street is silent, save for the shuffle of boots and the faint creak of saddles as men mount up to ride home. And you, scarf loose and tired from all the unwritten lessons, realize the saloon was never about duels, glamour, or whiskey worth savoring. It was about codes, quiet, invisible threads that held the chaos together. Without them, the room would have torn itself apart years ago. Funny, isn't it? The Wild West wasn't tamed by sheriffs or six-shooters. It was tamed by bartenders with rags, rules, and really bad whiskey. The lamps are out now, the saloon empty, and only the night remains. You step outside into the cool air, scarf light at your neck, and hear the hush of the street. The dust has settled. The chaos is gone. You picture the saloon behind you, dark and quiet. No clinking glasses, no shouts, no piano keys stumbling through a song. Just silence, layered over the memory of all those small rituals. Taps on the bar, nods of respect, scarves on chairs, and glasses marked with tokens. Rules that once kept strangers from tearing each other apart now drift like smoke into the night, and you let that stillness seep into you. The bustle and noise fade, leaving only calm. Your shoulders loosen, your breathing slows, and the day's worries begin to slip away. Each exhale feels like pushing open those old swinging doors one last time, leaving behind everything that pressed heavy on your mind. Above you, the stars are steady. Around you, the town is at rest. Nothing demands your voice, your coin, or your attention. The only rule left is the simplest one of all: rest when the night is ready. Let yourself soften into that rhythm. Imagine the scarf at your neck as a blanket, the darkened saloon as a safe shelter, and the silence of the street as a lullaby. You're part of the circle now. The night's final round has been poured, and it's peace.so. Close your eyes, breathe steady, and let the quiet rules of the saloon carry you gently into sleep.